name's William B. Cochran, and I was born in Kyle, Texas, on December the 18th, 1930, which is a long time ago. And I'm 79 years old, and I've lived in Hays County just the biggest part of my life, about 80 or 90% of it. So in other words, it's been my address for at least the last 60 years anyway. I was born at home with Dr. Lauderdale. He was wasn't born in a hospital, and when I got ready to go into the Army, my mother didn't have a birth certificate, so we had to go find a birth certificate to prove that I was born, and it was kind of funny, you know. But then I was drafted into the Army back in 1950, and you know, so that's been quite a while ago. And like I said, in those days, most people were born at home. I think all my family was born at home. My dad was James Hezekiah Cochran, and my mother was Beatrice Amanda Cochran. I believe they all come out of Tennessee. They come from Tennessee to Texas. But my dad only had about an 8th grade education. His mother died when he was young, and they had 5 kids, and he had to quit school to help support the children. Well, Grandma Wimberley, they settled a little town of Wimberley, Texas. Pleasant Wimberley was her father. Well, my grandmother Wimberley, she was probably in her 80s or 90s, and before she died, she came and lived with our family for about 5 months, and she would tell me stories about the Cochrans and about the Wimberleys, and you know the good old days, as some people call them. They weren't very good, according to Grandma Wimberley. And she told me stories about the Indians and that she had heard from her mother, and they were also from Tennessee. They migrated from Tennessee into Texas, and so she told me a lot of stories about the Indians and settling up Wimberley and the mill race there in Wimberley, and when they opened the grist mill there in Wimberley. So she told me some stories about that and how they had to redo the mill, and she was really an interesting person to talk to. I had 4 brothers and 4 sisters, and there was Geraldine, Maggie, Hazy, and Bootsy, and there was Pug, Doc, Claude, and me. So I had the 4 brothers and 4 sisters, come from a large family. And my grandmother Wimberley, she had 15 in her family, so I had a lot of uncles and aunts, on that side of the family. My mother wrote a lot of poetry. She wrote some about when the Koreans took over the Navy ship, the Pueblo. She wrote a poem about that, and it was published in the, I believe, the San Antonio Light. And she had wrote quite a few poems and quite a few songs, and she was really gifted at things like that, writing poetry. And I used to sit up at night, while she was writing her poetry. And the first home that I remember living in, I was born in the Kyle, just right outside of Kyle. The little community was called Goforth. And I was 6 years old when I started to school there in Kyle. And then later on I went to school in Kyle. But that's about the only town or only place we went to was Kyle in those days. Because everywhere you went, it was horse and buggy or a wagon, or I guess some people had cars, but we didn't have one. So, and my dad worked for the bank there in Kyle, and for several years. Well, in the Yeah, I went to the second grade in Kyle there, and I remember, the old school is still there. We went to school in a little tiny building. It's still there in Kyle. It's only about maybe 30 by 40, I guess. The old building's still standing there, and we went to school in that little building. I think we had five grades in the one building, and I'm trying to think. He went from the first to no, it went from the first to the seventh grade there, and it was about 17 students in our classroom. Well, we didn't have too much time for play. It was mostly work and go to school, and it was just we had a real small playground with a merry-go-round, and that was just about the size of it for recess and what have you. You go outside the merry-go-round, and I think we did have a swing, and that was it. Oh yes, they disciplined. You didn't bring up your lessons, and you didn't stay up. Those teachers got hard with you in those days. They whop you with a ruler, or they get your attention, especially if you dozed off in school. Now that was bad news. We usually, when we got home, we took off our school clothes, put on our work clothes, and we went to the field. Usually I guess in June, July, where we'd go to my dad, we grew cotton and corn, and we'd come in the afternoon, take off our clothes, and pick cotton till almost dark. Then we would come in and milk about 5 cows, and of course we fed all the animals around the place, and we didn't really have much time for pleasure or for fun. About our only time we had any fun was on Sunday, because we worked every day except Sunday. My dad always made sure we took off on Sunday. We went to church, and Sunday was our greatest day. We had time to eat and to rest and to find a place to go swimming. Sometimes it was just in an old mud tank, but at least we just had a little recreation. And we had all days, Sunday, and it was really we had time to go visit with our friends, and had our friends to come over, and like I say, Sunday was our best day.
Did you eat a special meal on Sunday?
Sunday, if we were lucky, we had chicken on Sunday, and Mother always cooked biscuits and chicken and cornbread, and usually always invited at least 1 or 2 neighbors over, for Sunday dinner. And occasionally the preacher would come over for Sunday dinner. But that was just our best day, because we really needed to rest. We really worked hard. We didn't have much time for play. He worked for the bank. He was he worked for the bank, he was a collection agency for the bank. He'd go to, if people couldn't pay their rent or pay their bank note, they'd put up their horses or their mules as collateral for their note. And if they didn't pay the note, he'd have to go out and take their horses or their wagon or whatever they put up. And like he told me, a lot of times if you didn't have a wagon and some mules to work the land, you were in terrible shape. So a lot of times he would tell the bank, he'd go out to pick up the horses, and he'd tell them, I just couldn't catch them. It was, because that was the only way they had of making a living, was something to plow the land with and to grow their crops. And if they took those away, the family had no way of making a living. So a lot of times he would tell the bank, I just couldn't catch the horses, and he'd go back, and then of course if they couldn't catch them, then the bank would write it off. And he said they were really tough times in those days. We had the old saying that we had 3 meals a day. Had oatmeal, cornmeal, and missa meal. And that was pretty well true. In other words, we lived on just whatever we could grow or whatever we planted, or And but we always had meat. We had hogs and what have you. We never actually went hungry, but it wasn't the best of times, I'll tell you for sure. I had 4 brothers that served in the military, 2 in the Army, 1 in the Navy, and 1 in the Air Force. And one brother spent 4 years in Germany in during World War II, and the other one was in the medics here in the States. And James spent 4 years on Guam, and Claude spent 2 years in the Navy. And he was at, when the Japanese surrendered, he was on one of the ships when the Japanese surrendered to the Americans. We had rationing for shoes, rationing for tires for your car, rationing for sugar, rationing for coffee. And being in a large family, it was real difficult because we couldn't get, and a lot of times even if we did have the stamp to get the stuff with, we didn't have the money to buy it with. So it was, and all my brothers was in the service, so, and my sisters were married and gone, so I was the only one at home during the war years. The only communication we'd get from our brothers was we'd get a letter. It was always censored, a real small letter, and just every now and then. The mail wasn't too good back in those days. But sometimes on the weekends in the winter time, sometimes we had what we called house dances. We would all gather together at someone's house, and everybody played, guitars and fiddles and what have you, and we just all have a get together. And one uncle of mine, he had a band, and he would just go from house to house. We always had it at a different place, but we always had our house dances, and they were really enjoyable. Of course, I was awful young, and well, I remember our greatest time was coming to Camp Ben McCullough up here for the reunion at Camp Ben McCullough. We'd get in a wagon and come up and spend a week at Camp Ben McCullough here close to Dripping. And that was a wonderful time for us. Well, my mother and dad, they were religious people, they believed in going to church, but my dad and mom mostly taught us the golden rule, to do unto others, and they really, they weren't real hard people to get along with. They could, if you had a problem, you went to them, they'd help you solve it, and they were just wonderful parents. They just couldn't have been any better. We had a radio during the 30s, a battery radio, and about all we could really listen to was the news, because I had 4 brothers in the war, and we would listen to the news report, and that was just about it. We had little time to listen to music, but I remember some of the old radio shows like Stella Dallas and As the World Turns, and those old and we'd listen to some of those on radio. Yes, I sure do. I remember listening to the president when they bombed Tokyo. That was, and then as the war was progressing over, when it got close to the end of the war, we listened to the news almost every day. Because my mother had 4 boys, in the war, and when Korea come along, she was upset because I had to go they drafted me, and I was drafted in 1950 there in Martin. No, I believe we were living in San Marcos, and then we moved to Martindale, and they drafted me, and then I went up to Fort Hood, took my basic at Fort Hood, and in 6 weeks they shipped me from Fort Hood right on over to Korea. So I didn't get to spend much time in the States. It was just, they were really needing some people over there. Only made one phone call from Japan, and I think it was $50 a minute. it was two-way radio phone call from Japan over here. And my granddaughter's husband just came back from Korea about a year ago. He called home every day. And I got one phone call from Japan when I went on R&R back to the States, and I think it was $300 or $400 for that one phone call. I started playing, my mother played the guitar, and I started playing the guitar probably when I was about 5 years old. And I went on, after I got out of the Army and come back from Korea in 1951, well, I had a small band. It was called the Lariats. And we played some of the local clubs, and like Gill's Club in Austin and some of the clubs there in Ulan, and we played Club 21, and so I kind of got into that and really enjoyed it. And later on in years, well, I went with Willie Nelson's dad a few times where they were playing, and played some music with them, and I really enjoyed that. And right up until Pop Nelson died. After he died, well, you know, that was, I never did play with him anymore after that. Well, when I first came back from Korea, I went to work for Brown Schools in San Marcos as the maintenance director up there. And I worked for them for several years. Mentally retarded children. And we had 3 units there in San Marcos. And it was just, you know, for the children with Down syndrome. And after that, I went into the paint contracting business and was doing some federal contracts, you know, all over the state. I did some federal work up at Lackland and let's see, Fort Hood. I did some up there. It was just mostly, you know, contracts for the government. I think the first construction job I went on was over at El Rancho Sima. That was a Boy Scout camp for Hays County. And I said I'd never eat another lunch on the ground after I come back from Korea. And the first thing you did, we went over and went to work. We had to take our lunch every day. Let me tell you a little bit about San Marcos. San Marcos had one theater, had one hot dog stand, and had one hamburger stand. And I was trying to think. Yeah, the one, no drive-in. And you knew everyone in town. When you walked down the street, you knew everyone. Just 99.9% of the people, you knew them personally. And the only, most of the income from San Marcos was from the academy. In fact, I worked for the academy for a while, and but it was such a small town, and the fish hatchery down there, when Lyndon Johnson became president, he gave the fish hatchery to the college down where the old Stick Beach building is now. So he said the college needed it worse than the fish, so he just gave it to them. But San Marcos was very, very small in those days. Yeah, I remember going to the movie, going to the, I think, Mr. Zinnerman had the movie, and we could go to the movie on Saturday, and Dad gave us a quarter each, and that was for your popcorn and your candy, and our tickets were 15 cents. So you had a dime for your you know, to spend. So that, like I say, it was 15 cents for your ticket. So I give you a dime, you could get a nickel bag of popcorn, a nickel bag of candy. And always the cereal, they always had a cereal from week to week. And it was usually Tarzan, the Tarzan cereal. But we'd always like to go from 1 week to the next so we keep up with what was happening. It's kind of like your soap operas now on TV. if you missed a week, you got behind on the little ones that they showed. But we had a lot of times we had to walk, to get to the movies. But we had the San Marcos River, and so you could go swimming before you went to the movie and go swimming after the movie. So I come up to Dripping Springs, and I really liked it up here. It was really pretty. Had a beautiful spring coming out down below the house here, and so I went down, built a dam down there, and so I've been here 20 years, and it's just really nice. I just love Dripping Springs. When I first moved up here, it had one little grocery store and a small post office and one cafe, and you could drive from here to Austin and maybe pass one car, or you could drive from here to San Marcos and maybe pass 2 cars. There was just hardly no traffic at all, and it was just but they had 4 churches. You had a choice on churches in Dripping Springs, and but it was just such a small town. I mean, just hardly anything here. There was no industry, and all they had here was just the little store up there. They had a place where people brought their sheep in. They sheared the lambs and brought the wool in to Rippy's place up here and sold their wool every year. And it was just very, very small. We call it Madrona Springs. Madrona in Spanish means strawberry. So we have trees here that grow nowhere else except right in this area. They're called a madrone tree. Madrona is, they grew, so I just named the springs. Yeah. And I'd been collecting airheads all my life. And my mother collected airheads, and I still have, a few of them left. But it was like I say, in this country here, it was mostly the Comanche and the Taronqua down on the coast, was in this area. So they made beautiful arrows.
What started your interest in that? Did you have an interest in the Indians?
There was a lady in San Marcos. Her name was Miss Story, and she was with the archaeology department in Austin, and she was Roger Story's wife, I believe. And she told me, we got to talking about airheads, and then she kind of got me interested in, really getting into it. So we dug for airheads all over this country. We dug down in Little Arkansas. Well, that's all over this area. The immediate area. We never really got out of this area. I still love to play music, although I've got a heavy emphysema now, and my voice is not real good anymore. And so sometimes we'll set up just a family and all get together on Christmas, and especially on Thanksgiving, and all just sit around the living room and play a little music.
Tell a little bit more about what kind of music you like.
Well, I think I was just born and raised on country music. I like all kinds of music. I think country music is most down to earth, and country music used to tell a story. It used to tell you about a bad love affair or a happy time, so country music to me just kind of tells you a story. My all-time favorite country singers was Merle Haggard, Willie Nelson, of course, and I'd say George Jones. They were all, my favorite singers. And they're all getting up in age now, but some of them still around, still going. Okay, I got a 1937 Martin guitar that during World War II, Hank Williams was playing over at the old, I think it was the Roundup in San Antonio. And my brother was in the Navy, and he was on furlough, and he stopped there at the Roundup to the dance, and he said, this guy gave him a fifth of whiskey for this guitar. And I said, well, what did he look like? Well, he was kind of a skinny, tall dude. And I said, well, you know, that might have been Hank Williams. And he said, well, I don't know who he was. He said, I just traded with him. So he got me this. It was a 1937 Martin. So it's really, really old. And so my brother knew I liked, guitars and stuff. So he brought me that guitar. He said, hey, it may have been Hank Williams. I don't know. He said it was back, Hank Williams mother was living in San Antonio.
Yeah, might have been.
And he said, it might have been. He said, you might have a famous old guitar. And I said, well. A long time forgotten dream just fell by the way. And the good life she's living ain't the one she's living today. She never complains about the bad thing and the bad things I've done. Just talks about the good times we had, all good times to come. She's a good-hearted woman in love with a good-timing man. Oh, remember that. Was an old-fashioned meeting in an old-fashioned place. Some old-fashioned people had some old-fashioned grace. Like an old-fashioned sinner, I began to pray. Then God heard me and He saved me in an old-fashioned way. There was singing by those old-fashioned airs. There was power in those old-fashioned prayers. Like an old-fashioned sinner, I began to pray. Then God heard me and He saved me in an old-fashioned way. Then God heard me and He saved me in an old-fashioned way.